There is something profoundly amiss in this whole thing, and it has to do with the fundamentals of the climate theory. Spraying this the sulfur aerosols in the stratosphere to correct the amount of absorbed radiation by the sun is nothing short of bioterrorism. The warming that we had over the last 150 years is being beneficial. It has actually fueled our civilization. This is worse than what people believed 500 years ago, that witches were cooking the weather. We're talking about not only ignoring the data, but actively trying to manipulate the data in a way that actually hides the truth.
Ned, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine. How about you?
Thanks for doing this. So this is a little bit departure from our usual discussions, but nonetheless interesting. So, I was looking through your background. Obviously, I've been following you over on Twitter for quite a while, or X, I should say. And you have a particular interest in, I guess, some of the client science that's out there. Share your background with us for those that aren't familiar with you, if you don't mind.
So I am a physical scientist. I work for the federal government, actually for the Forest Service, and I've been a scientist all my life. And I have a Ph.D. in ecological modeling. And over the last 25 years, I've been managing or working at a project, and over the last 15 years, actually managing a project about developing fire weather applications. And those are basically, computer models that help assess the fire risk as related to weather, the weather forecast, because the weather is a major driver of the wildfires. And so, as a part of my work in that project, I got interested in climate in 2009 and actually started working on that 2010, 11. And the interest came from the ClimateGate emails that were released in 2009, I believe, at the end of 2009. And up to that point, I had no question about the science of climate, the theory of the climate change, and all that. In fact, I used to argue with some of my colleagues that were more conservative. They were not scientists, but they were, concerned about the exaggeration of the warming or the effect of the carbon dioxide on climate. So, and I would argue and say, there are thousands of scientists that are part of this IPCC, which is the UN body, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is the body that actually issues reports every 5 years or so. And the whole world is following that in terms of recommendations, and policies are being built on that. And this is actually the result. The IPCC is the reason why they have been in recent years pushed towards reducing carbon emissions related to human diet. Yeah, which I'll talk about this in a bit, but it's absurdity from a standpoint of thermodynamics and physics that you would claim that burps from cows, and the emissions of methane are affecting the climate. I mean, it's just pure lunacy. But anyway, so that's the emails that were leaked out. They were showing that the climate scientists were discussing among themselves how to manipulate data, how to hide certain things and not to disclose them. So that kind of created question in my head, why is this happening if the science is settled, right? So I started, I had a few questions in the beginning, and I said, I'm going to start reading about, I'm not interested in the politics because politics doesn't have any hard science. I'm a hard scientist. So I said to myself, I'm going to start reading the science papers and try to answer those questions that I had originally in my mind. And I thought within a few months, I'll answer the questions and that'll be it. So I was reading actually a lot of papers over the first 6 months of my journey. And at the end of those 6 months, I had more questions, and not really an answers to the original questions, but I had a lot more questions. So then I figured out there is something profoundly amiss in this whole thing, and it has to do with the fundamentals of the climate theory. So then I started looking into that, and one thing led to another, and we started making some discoveries. And if you want, I can go into some details about that.
Yeah, let me
Uh,
before you go into that, because I know you've talked. I heard you talking about the albedo coverage, and I think and most people have never heard of that, including myself until recently. Um, I guess there's a thought that some people say the climate is not changing. Some people say, well, the climate is changing, and it's a catastrophe, and others say, well, the climate is changing, but it's not a big deal. Where would you fall into those three categories?
Well, like everything in nature, there is no constants anywhere. Depending on the time scale you look at, everything changes, and we know this from our personal experience, and that's certainly true in physics. Even on a grand scale, on a cosmic scale, things do change as well. But some of the changes are occurring at a pace and a rate that is way beyond our perception as humans, because we have a limited lifespan, and we just could not comprehend those processes in real time. But everything is changing. So on that spectrum, I'm on the on the step where I think the climate is changing, but it's not profound, and it's not dangerous, and it's not human made. Now, the human made portion of it, it's only few people actually are kind of standing behind that idea. Even the skeptics, and I should say majority of the climate skeptics, including the ones that the scientists, they believe that CO2 has a role in climate change. And actually they argue that, well, it's not, doubling CO2 will not cause a 3-degree warming. It'll cause 1 degree, it'll cause half degree, but they don't dispute the foundation of the theory uh, that the CO2 is affecting climate. And what we have found in our research using actual modern data, planetary data from NASA, is that climate, the, the effect of humans is zero, because there has been a profound misconception about a fundamental property called the greenhouse effect. What is the nature of the greenhouse effect? In other words, what's the nature of the atmospheric thermal effect? And it has been known for about nearly 200 years now that the presence of atmosphere on Earth does create a much warmer environment compared to no atmosphere. And we can look at the moon, and NASA now has data for the moon, and the temperature extremes there are incredible. Like between day and night, you can have difference of 270 Kelvin, but the average temperature of the moon globally is much colder, uh, something like 70 plus degree colder than actually, I'm sorry, 87 degree colder than the temperature of the Earth. So we are the same distance from the sun. In fact, the moon receives on the surface much more solar radiation because it doesn't have any clouds to reflect light back to space. So, and yet, uh, despite despite that there is no clouds and more radiation being absorbed by the surface, the moon on average is about 87 degrees colder than the global temperature of the Earth. And that's a huge difference. So the atmosphere creates a thermal effect. The question is, what is causing this thermal effect? And the current mainstream theory that comes from the 19th century, actually, and it was proposed as a hypothesis based on conjectures because there were barely any data at that time. It says that we have those tiny gases that are in the atmosphere, like carbon dioxide, methane. Water vapor is also a trace gas, but actually is considered the major greenhouse effect, greenhouse gas. So those gases are called greenhouse gases because they have the ability to absorb and emit long wave radiation, right? Well, but when you look at the thermodynamics and you look at the NASA data, what we have discovered that the nature of the atmospheric thermal effect has nothing to do with the concentrations of those gases because it's not a radiative phenomenon. The cause of the thermal effect of the atmosphere is total pressure itself. So that was a major breakthrough. We published a paper in 2017 describing those findings. That changes everything. That means that variations of concentrations of trace gases. Now, for your viewers, to put things into perspective, the concentration of carbon dioxide now in the atmosphere is about 0.04%, 0.042%. Okay, so roughly a 0.04%. So very, very minor. The water vapor, which is the largest, the greenhouse gas that has the largest concentration, on average, it's 0.25%. Now in the tropics, you can have up to about a 2%, but it doesn't get a lot higher than that. Maybe in some cases where you have saturated humidity situation, you can get maybe to a 4%, but that's exceptional. It requires high temperature and very, very high humidity, right? So those are really trace gases, and what we have found is that, speaking about the albedo is basically the fraction of reflected solar radiation that goes back to space immediately, and it's lost to the climate system, which means it doesn't affect the temperature on the Earth, doesn't affect the climate dynamics on Earth, because it is not absorbed. It's like a mirror, like a certain fraction is being reflected back, and that fraction right now, it's 29% of the incoming radiation goes back to space immediately. And most of that reflection comes from the clouds, because clouds are white and they just reflect a lot of radiation. There is some radiation being reflected from the surface, from the glaciers and so forth, but by far the majority of that it's coming from the clouds. So what the NASA data have found, this project called CIRRUS, that started in 2000, and they've been measuring the energy fluxes at the top of the atmosphere that are coming out from the Earth, both short wave and long wave. Now, the long wave radiation is the result from the temperature of the Earth, right? Any physical body that has a temperature above absolute zero, it's a physical law, emits radiation, right? And because the temperature on the Earth is relatively low, much lower than the temperature of the sun, that radiation happened to be in the long wave spectrum, which we don't see, we don't perceive. But the shortwave radiation has a big portion in the visible in the visible band, which we can see, and that radiation is being reflected, actually, including in the infrared of the shortwave as well, from the clouds and going back to space. So that reflection, the fraction of solar radiation incoming that is being reflected, which is 29%, it's called albedo. And so NASA data, the NASA observations of the CIRRUS project, they have found that there has been a significant decline in the albedo of the Earth from 2000 to the present. And that decline is actually the result primarily of the decrease of the cloud cover over the oceans. So now what's driving that is the big question. And it's clearly not anthropogenic. In other words, clearly it's not caused by human, because people propose, oh, we're cutting forests, and when you cut the forest, you reduce precipitation, and that maybe reduces the cloud cover. Yeah, but this is over land. The vast majority of the change in the reduction in the cloud cover we see over the ocean, and there is no forest there, and no impact by humans. So apparently it's a cosmic forcing. There are some theories what this might be causing it, and one is the solar wind, the other one is the galactic cosmic rays, because those are particles that are creating the nucleus around which the water can condense and form the clouds. So it's a microphysical thing, in the atmosphere. But the data are not conclusive, and bottom line is we don't know for sure what's causing that, but what it's clear, it's not anthropogenic.
Let me ask you, because you said, I think you mentioned it was 29% of the solar radiation is reflected according to this albedo cover, whether it's the clouds or the white surfaces of the polar regions or something along those lines. And I assume that's based on, satellite imagery,
Yes.
how much cloud cover. We haven't had all that data for a very long time. Not like, we can go back to ice cores in Antarctica and we predict the temperature.
No, yeah.
Do we have an idea what the patterns of albedo cover has been historically over the centuries, or we just have data over the last few decades? Hey folks, it's Dr. ShawnBaker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up though, our spaces are filling up very quickly.
The real direct measurements are over the last 2 decades of the 21st century. There are some data from 85 to 2000, but the quality is not really great. So the resolution is poor, And I've seen the data, and they don't make much sense. They have exaggeration of the drop of albedo, for example, in 1991 when we have the Pinatubo eruption. When volcanoes erupt, big volcanoes on Earth, they do create area of aerosols that are blocking the sun, and so temporarily you may have actually a change in the absorbed radiation. You have a drop, which lasts like 2-3 years, and then it goes back to normal. But on those data, that early data, it shows an enormous drop and then recovery within a couple of years. But those are, I would say, poor quality data. The high quality data that we have, unfortunately, only for 2.5 decades right now.
And the year-over-year fluctuation is minimal, 1%. I don't know, what would it be, and how do we know it's increasing or decreasing?
Well, because the NASA Sirius data show clearly that there is a decrease in the albedo since 2000. It goes up and down, but the trend is going down. And interestingly, our analysis have shown that when you convert that change in albedo into what would mean for the change in the global temperature, so there is a way to model that, infer the change in global temperature from the albedo changes, and then you compare that model temperature to the actually observed temperature, you have a match, which tells you that what we have observed in terms of warming over the last 25 years is explainable 100% by the change in the albedo. And there is no room left for anything called, radiative forcing from CO2 or greenhouse gases in general. And actually, our analysis will have shown even more profoundly is that the long-wave radiation, which is measurable, it exists in the atmosphere, it is actually a product of the temperatures of the atmosphere. It's not a driver of climate. In climate science, they consider this basically an extra flux of energy, but it's not an extra flux of energy because this energy is a manifestation of the temperature of the energy that's already in the atmosphere. It's not new energy. So to give you an example, the total absorbed radiation by the Earth system, including the atmosphere and the surface and everything, it's about 240 watts per square meter. That's coming from the sun, right? At the surface or near the surface, we observe long-wave fluxes coming down towards the surface in the order of 343 watts per square meter. And the flux that's coming from the surface up is in the order of 398, close to 400 watts per square meter. So you have a clear sign that something is causing the amplification of the solar radiation that is absorbed, because the actual absorbed solar radiation could not account by itself for the temperature that we observe on Earth. The temperature on Earth is much higher than the solar radiation alone would allow for, right? So the answer to resolving this, in the standard climate science, they're using those radiative transfer models, and they say, oh, this is the greenhouse effect. Look, yes, you have long-wave radiation coming to the surface, and that's the one that's driving the warming and this and that. Well, no, because this enhancement of the energy, of the solar energy near the surface, cannot be explained by simple absorption and irradiation of energy. The example would be, imagine you have two bank accounts, and in those bank accounts, you have like, $100 in one and $240 in the other, and you start to transfer money back and forth between the accounts. Do you expect that your money will multiply somehow? Not, right? So that the radiation itself could not explain this thermal enhancement or thermal amplification that we see at the surface of the Earth compared to the solar radiation that is being absorbed. So the answer to that is that this amplification actually comes from the total pressure itself. And this is something that the viewers need to understand. Why? I mean, I know that for people that work in thermodynamics, atmospheric physics, the pressure effect on temperature is not anything new. But for the layman, like probably majority of the people that are following you with respect to diets and so forth, they have never heard this before. Well, how come? What is this pressure? Well, the pressure, if you look at the gas law, the pressure is directly related to the energy of the gas, because the gas law says P times V, pressure times volume of the gas, is proportional to the temperature of the gas. And so without pressure, you could not have energy, and therefore you could not have temperature. So pressure is an essential part because it's a force. And in physics, you need to have force before you have energy. There is no energy without a force, because if you look at the units, how the units are structured, the units of joule is basically, one of the definition is actually pressure times volume. This equals joules, right? If you go
Yeah.
into the dimensional analysis of those units, you can see that. But anyway, so our discovery was that the thermal effect of the atmosphere is caused by the pressure itself, total pressure, regardless of the composition of the atmosphere, because we were able to see a very accurate and sound relationship that predicts the thermal effect of the atmosphere not only on Earth, but on a bunch of other planets and moons throughout the solar system. So Earth is a part of a cosmic continuum, which is a much stronger evidence. We're not just looking at Earth at like one planet. We're actually putting this into the context of the cosmic continuum. And once you see this kind of strong relationship, pressure explaining the relative thermal effect of the atmosphere, not only on Earth but on a bunch of other planets, spanning pretty much the whole range of the solar system, from Venus to Pluto, basically, you have a new physical law. I mean, that's not a coincidence.
Yeah,
So
I'm just going back to my high school chemistry. I remember Boyle's law and Charles' law, these
yeah,
gas laws, and it was usually within a fixed container. And is the Earth's atmosphere is that considered as a fixed container? Is
no,
that how
it's
you
not.
do it?
It's not a fixed container. No, so there are different thermodynamic systems. What applies to Earth is called isobaric system, where at the surface the pressure is more or less constant, but the volume is free to expand, and the volume expands based on the heating, which is why in the atmosphere there is a thing called tropopause. This is the first layer that is adjacent to the surface of the Earth, and at some about 10 kilometers above the surface, the temperature drops until to that point, and then it stops, and then it's a little bit constant, and then it starts to increase in the stratosphere, right? So the troposphere, this lower layer, is where all the weather happens. This is what we see. In the stratosphere, there's pretty much no weather because there's no clouds, right, for the most part. There's a little bit of water vapor, and there's also CO2 and all the other gases, but the weather really happens in the troposphere. So the tropopause is an indication of the volume of the atmosphere. And if you look at the tropopause, where the troposphere ends and the stratosphere begins, in the tropics, the tropopause is like 18 kilometers above the surface, when in the polar regions it's somewhere like 8-9 kilometers above the surface, right? So that's because the heating is different in the tropics compared to the polar regions, and so the atmosphere, when it's heated more, it expands, the volume increases, right? So yeah, okay, that I think that was the answer to your question, right?
So just to kind of summarize here, the climate is changing to a small degree. It's not a catastrophe. It's not related to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. It's related to the absorption of solar radiation modified by albedo. And we don't know why the albedo is changing. Do we have any sort of suspects? Are we saying this is most likely driving this? Because you said it's primarily over the ocean. So is it just natural cycle, or what do we think?
Well, it is natural cycles. The question is what's driving the cycles, and there is some research that shows the solar wind is impacting the formation of cloud condensation nuclei, which are the seeds for the formation of clouds. There are other observations that show the cosmic rays doing the same thing. And then the theory with the cosmic rays is that when the magnetic activity of the sun increases, it kind of shields more the Earth from the cosmic rays, so the flux of cosmic rays decreases. And when the flux decreases, that allows less clouds to be formed. However, when you look at the data, especially over the last 40 years on a global scale, this doesn't pan out. In other words, the cosmic rays have been actually increasing because the solar activity generally has been decreasing over the last 40 years. And that's supposed to create more clouds and higher albedo and cooling, but we actually had warming. So, I recently posted something about that on X, and I said, there is a person in Denmark, a scientist, his name is Svensmark. He has a whole team of people, and he's been actually investigating this cosmic ray connection to the cloud cover for the last 25, maybe 30 years. He has written a lot of papers, and yes, they have some observations on short-term effects of the cosmic rays. Those bursts of cosmic rays, how they affect the cloud cover on short term. But long term, the data show that this is probably not the factor. There is something else going on. My suspicion is that the formation of clouds have to do something with the electric activity and the electric field of the Earth, because there is an electric field. There is a voltage potential from the surface going to the top of the troposphere, which is pretty steep. So you have a lot of electrical phenomena, and people can understand that by thinking about lightning, how prevalent is lightning. And so those electrical phenomenon, they have an impact on the cloud formation somehow. We just need to find what. So there may be some interactions of changes in the geomagnetic field of the Earth, and in combination with the solar wind and variations in the coronal mass ejections, for example, that are coming from the sun. But the picture is not clear. But it doesn't mean that you have to, because we don't know exactly what's causing the change in the cloud cover, it doesn't mean that we have to resort back to the old idea. Oh, that's the CO2, because there are climate models, and some papers have appeared for the first time in 2014. In the climate models, the CO2 is causing warming in the middle of the atmosphere, and that warming is causing the reduction of the cloud cover because there is less condensation in that area. And so then the clouds in the models reduce, and you have more radiation coming to the surface. And they say, oh, look at that. The models actually predict that. Well, no, because the magnitude of the cloud cover change and albedo change that is observed, and the spatial pattern of that change, very different from the one that's in the model. The fact that overall you have the same effect, it doesn't mean that the models are explaining actually what's happening. They're not explaining. And we know for sure that, there is no effect of CO2 on the warming, zero, because CO2 is like I said, is a 0.04% concentration. But more importantly, it's a non-condensing gas, which means it's in terms of thermodynamics, it's no different than nitrogen and oxygen because it's transparent to solar radiation, right? It doesn't affect albedo at all directly. And all this effect that is in the model is through the warming effect of CO2, which is the result in the model from basically a violation of the energy conservation law, because they solve, the equations. They have an algorithmic error there where they decouple the convection from the long wave radiative transfer. And by decoupling those two things in the system, you get a wrong solution. But that's, more technical stuff. But the models are wrong.
Let me ask you, there's people that are, they talk about mitigating climate change through various, obviously making me go vegetarian or, banning fossil fuels or something like that. And there's people, I think guys like Bill Gates have proposed putting particles in the atmosphere to reflect the sun, maybe further increasing the albedo, I suppose, is what they do. Is there any, do you see that as a potential solution, or unnecessary? Is it a solution to a non-problem? What are your thoughts? And I know there's people talking about weather manipulation and geoengineering, and people are out there spraying chemicals in the air from the jet planes. Is that all just nonsense conspiracy stuff? Is there anything to it? What is Bill Gates trying to do with that? Would it have an impact? What are your thoughts?
So what Bill Gates is proposing is real, and the experiments have been executed in some places, just locally. Now the chemtrails, and if there is industrial level of spraying of some stuff in the atmosphere, I've heard a lot about this, but I don't have 100% confidence that this is true. Maybe there is truth to it, but I just don't know. But the fact is that Bill Gates is funding this kind of exercise. It is true because it's on his website, and he's been talking about this. So, I mean, to start with this, it is a solution to no problem. Okay, it's not even a solution. Spraying stuff it's not like any stuff. They're spraying sulfuric aerosol or sulfur aerosols in the stratosphere. This is a real pollutant. this stuff will come down. It's like volcanoes when they erupt, they emit a lot of sulfur and sulfur aerosols, and eventually those come down. But the eruptions on Earth are here and there. If you want to, I don't think it's possible to actually saturate the stratosphere and really meaningfully impact the solar radiation that way, because that requires enormous amount of substance to be sprayed, and we don't have the technological capability to support anything like that. But beyond that, in the Clean Air Act, sulfur is a real pollutant. It's a toxic stuff. That they call a carbon dioxide a pollutant, which is a totally misnomer because it's a life-giving gas. We're breathing this out. This is not a pollution, it's not a pollutant because it's not toxic, unless you have very, very high concentrations, right? Like, over 40,000 ppm, then it may become toxic, but that doesn't exist anywhere. I mean, even in the submarines, the concentrations are not toxic, right? Of the CO2 that people occupy. Anyway, so to me, spraying this the sulfur aerosols in the stratosphere to correct the amount of absorbed radiation by the sun is nothing short of bioterrorism on a global scale. And it has to be looked like this because when you consider that this is a no problem, and in fact, the warming that we had over the last 150 years, it's been beneficial. It has actually fueled our civilization. I mean, the Industrial Revolution that started is partly result, or facilitated by this warming. In the past, when we had warm periods, like in the medieval warm period of time, like 1,000 years ago, the Vikings went and colonized a portion of Greenland. Then it got cold, and and they died off. But the civilizations historically has been always fueled by warm weather. I mean, look at the biodiversity across the globe now. Where do you find the highest biodiversity and teeming of life? In the tropics, not in the Antarctica or the Arctic, right? So
I don't know if I know when Al Gore had his documentary An Inconvenient Truth, which came out, I can't remember when it was, 15 years ago or something like that. Until recent times, we've had an increasing interest in climate change. The IPCC making some proclamations. There was a thing that 99% of all climate scientists agree the climate is changing. Those types of stats, which were maybe somewhat disingenuous in what they're talking about. Maybe they agree it's changing, but it's not a big deal. Do you feel, and obviously there's been a shift politically in this country and several others, and maybe some people are sort of having less concern about the climate than they did maybe say 3 or 4 years ago. What is going on currently with, I mean, obviously there are some people that are still driving this agenda quite heavily. There are other places that are kind of maybe dialing it back because the costs are enormous. Like I saw guys like one of the senators asking, are we willing to spend trillions of dollars to what end? And we don't even know if it's going to do anything. What's the current climate like in climate science, I suppose?
Well, the official climate science continued to push the narrative that trace gases, invisible trace gases like carbon dioxide and methane, are driving the warming. But like I said, the data from NASA, the most recent data, do not support that at all. So they're trying to avoid that actively to talk about this. In fact, in the latest IPCC report that was issued in 2021, there are some real methodological problems in some of the chapters describing the physics of the climate and the warming. And they even went as far as to ignore the serious data, in a sense that they don't talk about what is the implication of the observed decrease in albedo on the warming and how much more solar radiation has been absorbed. Because by 2019, you had so basically from 2000 to 2019, when the report was being prepared, you had about 2 watts per square meter of increase in absorbed solar radiation from the sun. Now, for comparison, their calculations show that since 1750, the so-called radiative forcing by CO2, which in reality doesn't exist, but they calculate in the models, it's 2.7 watts. So you have 2.7 watts in 270 years, compared to 2 watts just in 2 decades. Okay. And right now, it's actually at 2.5, 2.7 watts. If you add the 2023 and the recent warming that we had, the absorption of solar radiation is even higher. And so that equals, the entire radiative forcing from greenhouse gases for 270 years, according to their calculations. This stuff destroys their narrative. So what they did in the report, they don't discuss that. They mention the Cirrus data, but what they do is that they present a graph that says, oh, here is the reflected solar radiation from the Cirrus data. The Cirrus data, satellite data, they measure reflected. They don't measure albedo directly. The albedo is calculated, of course, but they measure the amount of shortwave radiation being reflected directly coming to the sensor from the Earth. And they measure also radiation coming from the sun, right, to the sensor. So what they did is that they present the original data from Cirrus that are reflected, but they flip them because it's an anomaly. It's a change with respect to arbitrary average, which happened to be the mean of the whole time series. They multiply this by -1, and the reflected radiation from going down starts going up. And they come up with some weird explanation, because in their convention, the fluxes that are coming towards the Earth down, they're positive. The ones that are going out are negative. So therefore, we multiply this by -1. Yeah, but in the caption of the figure, they still call it reflected solar radiation. So a person looking at the graph says, oh, reflected solar radiation is going up. That means the albedo is increasing, and yet we had warming. Of course, it makes sense that the warming was caused by CO2, right? Because it's not the sun. So the level of deception that those people go through is unbelievable. I mean, we wrote a letter that actually identified 3 major problems in the physical description of the climate by IPCC. We sent them the letter, and they replied after 3-4 months, and they denied all of that. Oh, they came up with those explanations that don't make any sense, and they said, well, the case is closed. They will not admit that actually those are problems. The ones that we identify, they're sufficient to invalidate the entire conclusions from the IPCC report, like 100%. And so we're talking about not only ignoring the data, but actively trying to manipulate the data in a way that actually hides the truth. That's what has been going on.
So, I mean, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was funded by who, created by who? Who does it serve? I mean, obviously, there's dissenting voices that are not being heard in many ways, and I'm sure you're not alone in this. My understanding is there's quite a few climate scientists that would say that we don't agree with the findings here. So, where is, I mean, again, the naive person me thinks it's good science should win out in the end, and there shouldn't be any untoward, manipulation of science or narrative building. But what's going on at the IPCC, if you can?
Well, the IPCC was established in 1990, but before that, a few years earlier, in 1988, there was a resolution by the UN, I think 4553 called, and that resolution said that there is evidence, that the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases is causing warming. In 1988, this is the year where we just started getting warm, because up to the late 70s, we've been having a cooling, and everybody knew that. People were making predictions that we're coming into a new ice age. There are lots of news articles written on that. Scientists would go to conferences, talk about this. And so after a few years, all of a sudden, and the whole thing started actually with Margaret Thatcher, but I can get to that a little bit later. But just to make the statement, the UN has passed the resolution under the influence of Margaret Thatcher, in part, that the greenhouse gases are causing warming. So therefore, urging governments to spend money investigating how greenhouse gases are causing the warming, right? So there was virtually no warming at that time to speak of, and no evidence that greenhouse gases are causing the warming at all. Yet this was the political decision, and once it came from the UN, then the governments, they got the green light, and they start allocating funds to study this. And the IPCC was established as a result of that in I think in 89, 80. In 1990 was the first report that they came up with. And it, the purpose of the IPCC was specifically to look, if you look at the founding documents, you actually can see that, specifically to look at anthropogenic causes of climate change, not climate change in general, and find out how climate is changing and what's driving it. Specifically anthropogenic. And once you start putting money, starting from the UN and going to individual governments into that narrative, scientists line up. Why? Because they're like every other person on the earth. They need to feed their families and they need to have careers. So they line up and they start producing what is expected. And the minute you start producing something that supports a narrative, you get promotions. Then you start, having students that you teach them this stuff, and the students, they realize that that's the way to make a career in this business, and that's how it goes. It is a sad picture, but I think the fundamental cause why this kind of a falsehood and basically a lie or misconception has survived for so many decades. Number one is intellectual corruption, and sometimes it's not even consciousness. The scientists just gravitate intuitively towards a path that will guarantee them success. Everybody wants to be successful in life, right?
Now, there's been criticism levied your way, given the fact that, several years ago, you and some other folks had published a document or a study using pseudonyms, not
Yeah.
using your actual names. Why was that done in that regard? And what's going on there?
Well, actually, this information is all online now. If you go to a Retraction Watch, there is an article that was written back in 2016, 17, I believe. But if you Google Nikolov Retraction Watch, I think you'll get it. There are actually two articles. But our original paper that we published in 2014 that deals with the fact that the atmospheric thermal effect has been underestimated, because the original estimate, which still is being promoted, they say that without atmosphere, without greenhouse gases, the Earth will be 33 degrees cooler. We found that this was based on a mathematical error, and the actual number is more like close to 90 degrees. The current number that which is based on the most recent data of the temperature of the moon that is provided by NASA, it says that it's 87 degrees. So that is a much larger warming caused by the atmosphere than the theory anticipated, and the theory could not explain that warming. So we had a lengthy paper, like 22 pages long, with equations and data and derivations and all that, technical paper. And we could not publish it because we tried, originally to publish with our real names, and at that time we were already known through some activity that we had online on blogs and stuff like that. I didn't have any social media account at that time. So when the reviewers Google our name, because the paper is very interesting, they Google our name, they find out, oh, those are the climate deniers, and they would write a negative review and criticize our paper on stuff that's not even in the paper. So we see that we could not get a fair review. So we thought we need to conceal our identity, but we wanted to do it in a way so that it doesn't, really sound. So it later on could be really deciphered and that it is shown that this is us. So what we did, we spelled our names backwards. and it went through the review, and the paper was published. Later, the publisher discovered, through some other people that notified him that we have done this. They contacted us and we explained what happened, and they said, okay. So they put a disclaimer like a erratum, like an error. Well, it was not an error, but just in this category, erratum, that explains that our real names are so and so, and we did that in order to get fair review and all that. So now this is now on the website of the publisher, and it's not a secret anymore. But basically, we had to go through this exercise in order to conceal our names to get fair review. It was not an attempt to, hide something. It was an attempt to hide our identity. So because we were not getting a fair review, and there was another paper that was already in press when somebody alerted the editor that our names have been changed. This was the second paper. And they decided on that one. This was in advances in space studies, I believe. They decided to uh, pull the paper, but they put a disclaimer that this was done based on mutual agreement with the authors and not related to the merit of the study. So the paper was pulled, but because it already has past peer review, the editor felt like, oh, I guess he was a supporter of the mainstream narrative, and the second paper specifically talked about that the thermal effect of the atmosphere is a pressure phenomenon, nothing to do with greenhouse gases, and he felt like too much for that. This was 2016. We published this paper later in 2017, another journal under our full names, real names, and now the paper is a part of the record.
All right. Well, this has obviously been a fairly technical discussion and probably will have gone over a lot of people's heads, unfortunately, and some of it to mine, to be honest. I mean, I'm not certainly a climate expert, but I have a scientific background, so I can understand quite a bit of this, and some of it makes sense. But I mean, as far as the takeaway message is here, should I be panicked about the climate change? I mean, should my kids be worrying about, because there's people having climate change diagnosis is causing their depression or anxiety. Is that just complete nonsense? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yes, it is a complete nonsense. And to me, it's just sad that some people take it such a nonsense so seriously. But it also tells you the power of the propaganda. When you're not expert in the field, and the same thing goes for the medical stuff. I mean, look at nutrition. How many people understand that the nutrition paradigm has been wrong for decades, right? And I have to make a point here to your viewers specifically that because they're probably aware, the ones that are following you, they're very much aware of the falsehood of the nutrition paradigm. Those false paradigms exist today, unfortunately, in all areas of science. And climate is not an exception. I mean, it exists in cosmology, archaeology, stuff that I've looked at. Everywhere there is those false paradigms. And they are politically motivated because, like I said, they were established a long time ago. The politicians start pouring actually money into that, and the scientists are following the funds, the grants. And that's how you get into these situations where, now the truth in climate with respect to satellite data is becoming obvious. And the funny thing, I have talked to people who are the manager of the Cirrus data, who is vividly aware of what his data is showing. He doesn't have the courage to say there is no CO2 signal here. There is no there is no anthropogenic signal here. It's all albedo. He says in his papers, well, yes, we have the significant increase in the absorption of solar radiation, and that's probably a contributor to the warming along with the greenhouse gases. Well, probably. If you do a quantitative assessment, you see that there is nothing left for the CO2 as a contributor. It's all explained by the increase of the absorption of solar radiation. So what I'm saying is that people that are intimately familiar with the data, they don't have the courage to speak up. I recently communicated with this person at NASA, and I said, now we have a new president, we have a new politics, and we have an executive order that was actually issued a few days ago about gold standards in science. You're probably familiar with that, that Trump issued. And so we need to have open discussions on this, and dissenting views have to be considered. And you have to look at the data, and you could not continue with this stupid ideology and basically a religion. It's unfounded and it's dangerous. At this point, I think it's dangerous because it just shifts the whole world into a dead end, economically, energy-wise, and everything.
Are there, this albedo phenomenon, are there like a specialist? Would they be cloud scientists? Who would be the guys that would be saying, because obviously you're not the only one that has looked at this stuff, I assume. And do they have a position paper or a statement regarding this stuff to support what you're saying or something similar?
Yes, the increase of the absorption of solar radiation by the Earth is documented in many papers, not just in ours. And it's like I said, it's in the official data. The thing that they have not done is a rigorous assessment that actually says what is the role of this how much of this can explain the warming and how much would be due to something else. And nobody has done this analysis except in our paper. We just did a step another extra step, and we showed that absolutely there is no CO2 signal. The increased absorption of solar radiation is sufficient to explain the entire warming. Now the climate scientists, the official ones, they say, oh yeah, okay, this may be probably a feedback. They try to put the albedo change as a feedback because in the climate models, like I mentioned, they do simulate this effect of decreasing cloud cover when CO2 causes the warming. Well, here's the thing: if the CO2 is causing warming, and then you have a positive feedback that reduces the clouds, and you have more warming because of additional radiation coming to the surface, you should have overall total warming much higher than what can be accounted by solar radiation alone. In other words, the CO2 effect should be still there, right? And it's not there. And it's not only the CO2 effect not there, but also the so-called positive feedbacks, which are supposed to amplify the effect of the CO2 and make the warming from 1 degree of CO2 doubling to 3 degrees. This is due to so-called positive feedbacks. The evidence for those feedbacks is not in the data as well. So we just have increase of absorption of solar radiation from the sun, period. And that's what's causing the warming. So the climate science is not, people are writing papers, but they're relying on models. They're viewing this through a colored glass, to a pair of glasses that are distorting the reality. And I believe, to me, the evidence, the data is so clear that those scientists are doing this because for political reasons. I don't think they are doing this because they genuinely don't understand and don't see what's going on. It is actually, at this point, actually it's a conscious distortion of the reality, or because of political and intellectual corruption, because they want to keep the funding going. Now, this goes still for Europe. In US here right now, there are big shifts happening, defunding of a lot, projects like that. I don't know what will be the outcome of that. I don't know if this defunding will cause some of the climate scientists to wake up, say, oh yeah, okay, we know of this all the time. Hopefully this will happen. But in Europe, because they have not gone through any political changes like what we're going through here, they still continue with the same narrative, and they're obscuring data and having wrong interpretation and all that stuff.
Okay, well, Dr. Nikolov, it's a pleasure. Thanks for doing this. We're about out of time. Where can people go to find out more about Albedo, the work you've talked about, for those that have a particular interest in this? What kind of website, or where can they find this?
So I mostly post on X, and my handle there at Nikolov Science. And then I have posted also on other blogs like the Toll blog, the talk shop of Toll blog. I've done a number of articles there as well. But on X, you can find pretty much all the links. Since 2017, majority of my posts are actually related to climate and different papers that I posted elsewhere. I have links to there. But yeah, on X would be the easiest way to find Nikolov Science.
Okay, and so by eating steaks and cows are not decreasing the albedo cloud cover. That's a fair statement.
Yes, it does decrease. You didn't hear what I said so far? No, I'm just kidding. No, absolutely not. I just want to say one thing here, just for perspective. 20 years ago, or maybe a little bit more, but 20 years ago, about the narrative was that the problem is not the burning or emission of carbons, the new carbon that's already on the surface. The problem is carbon that is being taken from the fossil fuels from the depth of the earth, because that carbon has been laying dormant, and now you put it in the atmosphere, and that's where the problem, because anything that you have on the surface of the earth in terms of ecosystems and animals and all that, it's part of the cycle that gets recycled, so that it doesn't increase the concentration in the atmosphere, the net amount, so therefore there's no warming from that and so forth. And the effort actually was to stop digging up fossil fuel and instead start burning wood and stuff that's biomass that's on the surface. Well, over the last 10 years or so, this narrative slowly shifted to the point that now raising cattle that emit little amount of methane, which is part of the natural cycle on the surface of the earth, is being now blamed for climate change. This is a total reversal from what it was 20 years ago. So I think this has to be done on purpose, because it's so absurd to get to a point in the 21st century to claim that cattle burps are causing climate change, this is worse than what people believed 500 years ago, that witches were cooking the weather. That's worse than that. I mean, I don't have words to describe it, So viewers should be absolutely not concerned with that. They have to know that this is not only wrong, it's absurd, and it has to do something with pushing some other agendas. And those agendas, I don't know what they're related to: depopulation, making people sick, all this push to, to have vegetarian diets and vegan diets, and it's just insane. It's just insane. By the way, for people to know, I used to be a vegetarian for 40 years. So I'm speaking from experience. I actually, from age 15 to age of 55, I was vegetarian. I barely eat even eggs. I ate dairy. I ate a lot of dairy. I'd never been vegan, though, right? But I was vegetarian, and then I started feeling, things are happening that I thought I'm getting old. I've been practicing yoga all my life, and flexibility has decreased a little bit, and pains and here and there, gaining weight. And then accidentally, I actually learned about the saturated fats are good for you. And the first time was a shocker to me. And then I started researching, and I got into this diet thing. And then, I found you a number of years later, and so forth. But it's been a journey. And I know from your little things that you said online that you were a vegan as well, right? At some point?
No, I was never vegan. I never did that.
Oh,
That's
okay.
somebody else. I certainly never did that. So, but yeah.
Okay. But you are different on diet, you're experimenting with diets in the past, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So.
Well, Dr. Nikolov, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for enlightening us on some new stuff. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.